The morning of March 3, 1943, began like many others in the waters near New Guinea. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura surveyed the ocean from where he stood on the command bridge of his flagship, watching the formation around him with practiced eyes. Spread across the waves in careful formation were 16 vessels under his command, a convoy whose safe passage represented more than just a naval operation. 8 destroyers formed a protective screen around 8 transport ships, and within those transports, crammed into every available space, were nearly 7,000 soldiers desperately needed on the front lines. Their objective was Lae, a critical position in New Guinea where Japanese forces were stretched thin and reinforcements had become not just desirable but absolutely essential to maintaining their hold on the strategic position. As the ships moved through the water, Kimura had every reason to feel confident about the mission ahead. The Japanese Navy had built its doctrine on hard-won experience, developed through countless engagements that stretched from the stunning surprise attack on Pearl Harbor all the way through the decisive victories in the Java Sea. The convoy before him represented the accumulated wisdom of that doctrine. The destroyers carried formidable anti-aircraft batteries, their gun crews trained through years of combat to respond to aerial threats with devastating efficiency. Multiple 5-inch guns capable of reaching high altitudes, dozens of rapid-firing 25mm cannons designed to shred aircraft at medium range, and banks of lighter machine guns to catch anything that slipped through the heavier fire created a layered defense that had proven itself time and again. The officers commanding these vessels had survived numerous engagements, their experience providing an intangible but valuable shield of tactical knowledge and battle-tested instincts. American bombers had already made several attempts to strike Japanese convoys in these waters, and each time the results had vindicated Japanese defensive doctrine. High-altitude bombing raids had proven largely ineffective, with aircraft releasing their payloads from heights where accuracy became a matter of chance rather than skill. Bombs fell in scattered patterns, splashing harmlessly into the sea, far from their intended targets, or at best inflicting minor damage that repair crews could address. Torpedo attacks presented their own set of challenges for the attackers. The aircraft had to commit to long, straight approach runs to align their weapons properly, and during these predictable attack patterns, they became perfect targets for the massed anti-aircraft fire from the convoy. Few planes survived such runs, and fewer still managed to achieve hits worth the terrible cost. Medium-level bombing occupied an awkward middle ground, giving defenders ample time to track the attackers and maneuver the ships away from predicted impact points. Based on all previous encounters, Kimura and his fellow commanders expected more of the same. They anticipated another attempt by American bombers using these familiar, largely ineffective tactics, and they felt prepared to repel such an attack with acceptable losses. What none of them could possibly have known, what they had no way of anticipating as they maintained their careful formation through the Pacific waters, was that the fundamental rules of engagement had been completely rewritten. Far to the south in Australia, something extraordinary had been taking place in workshops and maintenance hangars. American mechanics, working alongside pilots and tactical officers, had been conducting an experiment that would transform an ordinary medium bomber into something the Japanese Navy had never encountered before. The B-25 Mitchell, a capable but conventional aircraft, became the foundation for these modifications. Teams stripped away the bombardier's station in the nose of the aircraft, removing the clear panels and the equipment designed for high-altitude precision bombing. In place of that traditional arrangement, they installed something that would have seemed absurd to conventional military planners. Up to 850 caliber machine guns, all mounted to fire directly forward in a devastating concentration of firepower. These were not standard ammunition loads either. The machine guns were loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds, projectiles specifically designed to penetrate the thin steel plating that protected the vital areas of warships. Once through that plating, the incendiary component would ignite, setting fires that could rapidly spread across wooden decks, through fuel lines, into ammunition stores, anywhere the flames could find purchase. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, which they were designed to do, These modified bombers could unleash a storm of metal that approached 7,000 rounds per minute. To put that in perspective, it meant that in the space of just 60 seconds, 7,000 individual projectiles, each capable of tearing through steel and starting fires, would be hurled at a target. No warship of the era had been designed to withstand such concentrated forward fire. The armour schemes protected against shells arriving from predictable angles, and the anti-aircraft defences assumed guns would have time to track and engage targets following standard attack patterns. None of the Japanese defensive doctrine accounted for a bomber that functioned like a flying battleship turret, concentrating all its weapons in a single forward direction and firing them all at once. The installation of the guns was only half of the innovation that had been developed in those Australian workshops. The other half was a new attack technique that required considerable skill and extraordinary courage from the pilots who would execute it. Skip bombing, as it came to be called, was exactly what the name suggested. Pilots would bring their aircraft down to extremely low altitude, flying barely above the surface of the ocean, so low that their propeller wash would create visible spray on the water below them. At this altitude, they were well below the effective engagement envelope of the heavy anti-aircraft guns designed to reach high-altitude bombers. They would aim their aircraft directly at the target ship, charging toward it in what must have seemed like a suicidal approach. Then, at precisely the right distance, a calculation that had to account for the aircraft's speed, the bomb's characteristics, and the distance to target, the pilot would release the bombs. The weapons would strike the water and, if everything was timed correctly, skip across the surface like flat stones thrown by children at a pond. The difference, of course, was that these stones weighed hundreds of pounds and were packed with high explosives. When they reached the target ship, they would slam into the hull at or just below the waterline, exactly where the ship's armour was thinnest and where explosions would cause the most catastrophic damage. The technique demanded absolute precision in execution. Pilots had to judge distance and timing perfectly while flying at mast height toward a target that was almost certainly firing everything it had directly at them. There was no room for error, no possibility of aborting the attack run once committed, no chance to pull up and try again. Either the pilot got it right the first time, or they would likely not survive to make a second attempt. But when the technique was mastered through practice and refined through experience, it delivered a level of accuracy that conventional high-altitude bombing could never hope to match. The bombs arrived at the target with minimal dispersion, following predictable paths that were much harder for ships to evade. Combined with the devastating forward firepower of the modified Strafer B-25s, the tactic meant that target ships would be subjected to a withering storm of machine gun fire that would shred their gun crews and command structures before the bombs even arrived. The Japanese Navy had trained extensively for many different types of aerial threats, developing tactics and defensive measures for torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and high-altitude formations. But this new combination of low-level strafing followed by skip bombing represented something entirely outside their experience and their doctrine. They had no prepared response because they had never imagined such an attack was possible. That morning, as the convoy proceeded toward its destination, Japanese lookouts eventually spotted formations of American aircraft approaching. The sighting occurred at around 7,000 feet altitude, and to the experienced eyes watching from the ships, it all looked reassuringly familiar. Here was another attempt at high-altitude bombing, the same tactic that had failed so many times before. Gun crews moved to their positions with confidence rather than panic, certain they understood what was about to happen and equally certain they could repel it. The 5-inch guns elevated to their maximum angles, preparing to throw shells into the sky, where they would burst among the bombers and force them to scatter their drops. Dozens of 25mm cannons tracked the approaching formations, their crews ready to open fire the moment the aircraft came within effective range. Light machine guns added their own coverage, creating overlapping fields of fire that any aircraft attempting to approach at medium altitude would have to penetrate. Tracer rounds began to arc upward, creating visible streams of fire that marked the paths of the defensive fire and helped gunners correct their aim. It was exactly the response that Japanese doctrine prescribed, exactly what training and experience had taught them to do. And it was exactly what the Americans had planned for and were counting on. While every single gun in the convoy pointed upward at the high-altitude formations, while every eye and every weapon tracked those visible aircraft, the real attack was already developing from an entirely different direction. Coming in from the horizon at wave-top level, so low they seemed to merge with the sea itself, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters and the modified American B-25 Strafers thundered toward the convoy. The sound of their engines was lost in the noise of the anti-aircraft barrage firing at the high formations. The spray thrown up by their propellers created temporary wakes on the ocean surface. To anyone looking at the right place and the right time, they would have been visible, but no one was looking in the right direction. Every defender's attention was focused skyward, exactly as the attackers had intended. Major Ed Larner led the first wave of strafers toward the convoy, flying an aircraft he had nicknamed Ruthless. The name would prove grimly appropriate. He selected his target with the practiced eye of an experienced combat pilot, choosing the destroyer Shirayuki. From a distance of 1,200 yards, still closing fast, he opened fire with all 8 machine guns simultaneously. The effect on the destroyer was immediate and catastrophic. Hundreds of armor-piercing incendiary rounds tore into the bridge and superstructure in a concentrated stream. The thin plating that protected these areas, designed to stop shell fragments and small-caliber fire, offered no meaningful resistance to the 50-caliber projectiles. Officers on the bridge were cut down instantly, many of them killed before they even understood they were under attack. Gun crews manning the anti-aircraft positions that might have engaged Larner's bomber were shredded where they stood, some killed outright, others wounded so severely they could not continue to man their weapons. Survivors who lived through the initial attack and later gave testimony about the experience struggled to find adequate words to describe what they had endured. The most common description compared it to being caught in a giant metal saw, an industrial machine designed to cut through steel, except the saw was mobile and actively seeking them out. The violence and destructive power concentrated in those few seconds exceeded anything in their training or imagination. With the command structure on the bridge destroyed and most of the officers dead or dying, Shirayuki effectively lost the ability to coordinate any defense or even basic ship handling. The destroyer fell silent as its captain and senior officers were killed in the first seconds of the attack. Seconds later, while the ship was still reeling from the machine gun assault, 2 skip bombs released from Larner's aircraft struck home. The weapons had skipped across the water exactly as designed, maintaining just enough altitude to clear the lower hull before slamming into the destroyer's side. The explosions that followed were massive, tearing through the ship's internal compartments and rupturing fuel lines and magazines. The structural integrity of the destroyer's hull was compromised along a significant length, essentially breaking the ship's back. Shirayuki rolled heavily to one side as water poured through the massive holes torn in her hull. She began to sink almost immediately, her bow or stern, or possibly both, rising from the water as the middle section filled and dragged the ship down. What happened to Shirayuki was not an isolated incident occurring in one part of the convoy while others escaped. All along the formation, similar scenes were unfolding simultaneously as more strafers pressed home their attacks. The concentrated nature of the assault meant that multiple ships were being hit at the same time, fragmenting any possibility of coordinated defensive response. Other B-25s selected different transports as their targets, approaching the large, slow-moving cargo vessels in the same low-level attack profile. The machine guns opened fire at point-blank range, raking the ships from bow to stern in long, sustained bursts. Gun positions that might have returned fire were silenced in the first moments as the crews were killed or scattered. Bridge windows shattered under the impact of hundreds of rounds, killing or wounding the officers trying to direct the ship's defense and maneuver away from the attack. Then came the skip bombs, each one precisely delivered to strike at or below the waterline. The explosions tore through the cargo holds, where thousands of soldiers were packed together with minimal protection. The troops had almost no chance of escape once the bombs detonated below them. Bulkheads failed, compartments flooded, and the ships began to list heavily as water poured into spaces that were never designed to be flooded. The Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters added their own considerable firepower to the assault, though their role was somewhat different from the bomb-carrying B-25s. The Beaufighters concentrated their attacks on the ship's bridges and gun positions, using their 20mm cannons to devastating effect at close range. These larger caliber weapons could punch through structures that might stop machine gun rounds, destroying equipment and killing personnel with explosive shells. The combination of attacks from multiple directions, using different weapon systems and different tactics, created an overwhelming situation that the Japanese defenders simply could not process and respond to quickly enough. One transport after another burst into flames as incendiary rounds found fuel tanks, ammunition stores, or any of the 1,000 flammable materials present on a warship. Others began to take on heavy lists as flooding overwhelmed their pumping systems. The soldiers packed into the cargo spaces below decks faced absolute horror. Trapped in dark, confined spaces with water rushing in and no clear way to reach the upper decks, many drowned before they could escape. Those who did make it to the deck found a scene of utter chaos, with fires raging, aircraft still making attack runs, and no clear idea of where safety might be found. Multiple eyewitnesses who survived the attack later provided testimony that described the unbearable horror of hearing the screams of trapped soldiers echoing from flooded holds, even as more bombs continued to explode overhead and machine gun fire continued to rake the decks. The psychological trauma of being unable to help comrades who were drowning just meters away affected survivors for years afterward. Within just the first few minutes of the attack, before the convoy had any chance to develop an effective response or coordinate defensive measures, the formation had descended into complete chaos. Ships that had been proceeding in orderly formation were now scattered, some burning fiercely, others listing heavily and clearly sinking, still others trying desperately to maneuver away from the attacks, but finding that every direction seemed to bring them into the path of another strafer. The destroyer Horatio, recognizing the desperate situation, attempted to fulfill her designed role as convoy escort by positioning herself between the vulnerable transports and the attacking aircraft. Her captain tried to use the destroyer's superior maneuverability to shield the slower cargo ships, interposing his vessel between them and the strafers in hopes that the destroyer's heavier armor and better damage control might allow it to absorb attacks that would be fatal to a transport. It was a brave decision that followed established doctrine for convoy protection, but doctrine had not anticipated this type of attack. Instead of successfully protecting the convoy, Horatio simply became the next target. 3 separate B-25s identified the destroyer and concentrated their fire on her, understanding that eliminating the escorts was essential to reaching the transports. Their combined firepower created a storm of projectiles that exceeded anything the destroyer's designers had planned for. The bridge was hit repeatedly, the concentrated fire shredding the structure and killing everyone inside, including the captain. The command staff was wiped out in seconds. Skip bombs followed the machine gun assault, and at least one scored a direct hit that tore open Horatio's hull and caused catastrophic damage to the steering mechanism. The rudder jammed in position, and with no way to control the ship's direction and no officers alive to direct damage control efforts, Horatio became unsteerable. The destroyer began turning in a wide circle, completely out of control. By terrible chance, or perhaps because of the confused state of the convoy with ships maneuvering frantically to avoid attacks, Horatio's uncontrolled turn brought her directly into the path of the transport Nojima. The two ships collided with substantial force, their hulls grinding together and then locking in place as damaged metal caught and held. Trapped together, neither ship could maneuver away as fires from one spread to the other. The flames found ready fuel in the paint, wood and supplies present on both vessels. Crews from both ships attempted to fight the fires while simultaneously trying to separate the vessels, but the situation was hopeless. The two ships remained locked together as the flames consumed them both. From his position on the flagship's bridge, Admiral Kimura watched the destruction of his convoy with a sense of disbelief that bordered on paralysis. Everything he had been taught, every tactical principle that had been drilled into him through his career, every lesson learned from previous engagements was being proven catastrophically wrong before his eyes. The carefully assembled convoy that doctrine assured him would survive any reasonable air attack was collapsing into ruin all around him. The defensive measures that should have protected the transports had failed utterly. The anti-aircraft guns that should have driven off the attackers had been caught looking the wrong direction. The destroyers that should have shielded the transports were themselves being sunk. The Americans were not following any of the established patterns. They were not executing torpedo runs that required long, predictable approach paths. They were not conducting clumsy high-altitude bombing that scattered ordnance uselessly across the ocean. Instead, they were charging in at point-blank range, flying so low that the heavy anti-aircraft guns could not depress far enough to engage them, pouring machine gun fire into his ships with a volume and intensity he had not thought possible from aircraft, and then delivering bombs with a precision that matched or exceeded what the best bombardiers could achieve from altitude. The defensive doctrine that had been built on years of experience was revealed as completely inadequate against this new form of attack. Evasive maneuvers, which had proven effective against high-altitude bombing and somewhat effective against torpedo runs, offered no escape from strafers approaching at wave height and dropping skip bombs from close range. The time between when a ship's lookout spotted an incoming strafer and when that strafer was in firing position was measured in seconds, far too little time to change course or speed significantly. Every ship in the formation, regardless of its position or its captain's skill, became a viable target for the circling aircraft. There was no safe location within the convoy, no formation that offered protection, no maneuver that could guarantee survival. The slaughter continued for approximately 15 minutes, though to those experiencing it the time likely felt both much longer and somehow compressed. Each wave of aircraft arrived, selected targets, made their devastating attack runs, and departed to make way for the next wave. By the time the last B-25 pulled away from the convoy, climbing back to altitude and turning toward base with empty bomb racks and depleted ammunition, the sea was littered with burning and sinking ships. Transports that had carried thousands of soldiers, vessels representing months of construction effort and precious resources in an increasingly resource-constrained war, were torn apart. Their decks were wrecked by machine gun fire and bomb explosions, their superstructures aflame, their cargo holds flooded with seawater and filled with the dead and dying. Survivors who had managed to reach the open deck or who had jumped or been thrown into the water faced yet another horror as Allied aircraft made subsequent passes to strafe lifeboats and swimmers. This action, deeply controversial even at the time and afterward, was justified by operational necessity. Every soldier who reached Leh would strengthen the Japanese defensive position there. From the Allied perspective, preventing those reinforcements from arriving was the entire purpose of the mission, and that purpose did not end just because the men were in the water rather than on ships. From the perspective of the Japanese soldiers floating helplessly in the ocean, watching aircraft deliberately targeting swimmers, it represented a new level of brutality in a war that had already shown considerable brutality. The air filled with smoke from the burning ships, the chemical smell of explosives, and the cries of men drowning or calling for help that would not come. When the final accounting was made of the convoy's fate, the numbers told a story of almost complete destruction. Of the 8 transport ships that had departed from Rabaul carrying reinforcements and supplies, all 8 had been lost. Every single transport was either sunk outright during the battle or so heavily damaged that it sank shortly afterward. 4 of the 8 destroyers had also been sent to the bottom, including Admiral Kimura's flagship. The survivors, those who had managed to survive the initial attack, the subsequent strafing, and the hours in the water waiting for rescue, clung to debris and life rafts while submarines were dispatched to recover as many as possible. The submarines could only carry limited numbers, and their operations were constrained by the need to avoid Allied aircraft and vessels that were now actively hunting for any survivors. Of the nearly 7,000 troops that had been loaded onto the transports and sent toward Leh, fewer than 1,200 survived to eventually reach land. The mortality rate exceeded 80%, a catastrophic loss by any measure. For the Japanese army units desperately awaiting reinforcement in New Guinea, the battle represented an unmitigated disaster. The troops and supplies they needed would not arrive. Their situation, already difficult, became critical. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the implications went far beyond the immediate tactical loss of ships and men. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented a fundamental revelation that their entire doctrine for convoy protection and logistical operations was broken. The assumptions upon which they had built their defensive strategies were proven false. Ships could not be adequately protected by anti-aircraft guns and destroyer escorts alone, not against this new form of attack. The impact of this realization reached the highest levels of naval command within days. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who commanded the combined fleet and was arguably the most capable and respected naval officer in Japan, immediately grasped the full strategic significance of what had occurred. Yamamoto understood better than most that modern warfare was as much about logistics and supply as it was about combat. His own planning for the war had emphasized the need to secure resource areas and maintain supply lines. Now, looking at the wreckage of the convoy and understanding the tactics that had destroyed it, he reached an inevitable conclusion. If surface convoys of this type could not be protected adequately, then forward garrisons could not be supplied by conventional means. Every outpost that depended on regular shipments of food, ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements was now at risk. The maritime supply network that sustained Japanese positions across the Pacific had been shown to be fatally vulnerable. From that day forward, Japanese shipping across the Southwest Pacific faced a new and relentless threat that would only grow worse as American forces refined their tactics and built more Strafer aircraft. The modified B-25s rapidly gained a fearsome reputation among Japanese sailors and soldiers, who began to refer to them by various names, none of them complimentary and all of them reflecting the terror these aircraft inspired. The field modifications that had been carried out in Australian workshops were quickly recognised as effective enough to warrant adoption by the manufacturer. Word reached North American Aviation, the company that built the B-25, and they began incorporating the 8-gun nose into their production models. Soon, new B-25s were rolling off assembly lines already configured as Strafers, with the forward-firing armament installed at the factory rather than added afterward. Eventually, the design evolved further, with some variants carrying up to 18 forward-firing guns and additional armament, creating aircraft that were essentially flying gun platforms optimized for the ship-killing role. These purpose-built Strafers joined squadrons of the 5th Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force, and together they became the absolute scourge of Japanese maritime supply lines throughout the theatre. The impact on Japanese operations was immediate and profound. Daylight movement of ships larger than small fishing boats or coastal craft became effectively suicidal in waters where Allied air power could reach. Captains who had previously followed established shipping routes and schedules now had to consider whether making a particular passage in daylight was worth the near certainty of air attack. In many cases, the answer was no, it was not worth the risk. Japanese logistics operations were forced to shift toward alternative methods that could avoid daytime airstrikes. Submarines, which could submerge during daylight hours and travel on the surface at night, became increasingly important for supply runs. High-speed destroyer runs conducted under cover of darkness offered another option, with the fast warships racing to forward positions, quickly unloading their cargoes, and racing back before dawn could expose them to air attack. But these alternative methods, while safer from air attack, could deliver only a tiny fraction of what the garrison armies needed. A transport ship could carry thousands of troops and thousands of tons of supplies. A submarine or a destroyer could carry neither troops nor supplies in meaningful numbers. The result, across Japanese positions throughout the Pacific, was predictable. Starvation became endemic as food shipments failed to arrive. Medical supplies ran short, leaving wounded and sick soldiers without adequate treatment. Ammunition stocks dwindled, limiting the ability to conduct offensive operations or even maintain adequate defensive fire. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft and immobilized vehicles. The combat effectiveness of entire units degraded as malnutrition weakened soldiers and lack of supplies prevented them from fighting effectively. Morale plummeted as troops realized they were being slowly starved and that relief was unlikely. The Strafer, that improvised weapon created in workshops in Australia, had achieved strategic effects far beyond what its creators might have imagined. The tactics themselves continued to evolve as American and Australian squadrons gained experience and refined their approach. American pilots developed new attack profiles that combined the devastating forward fire with increasingly precise skip bombing. Practice missions were conducted against derelict ships anchored near Port Moresby, where crews could attempt skip bombing runs repeatedly until they mastered the precise timing and distance required. They experimented with different approach angles, different release points, different coordination between aircraft attacking the same target. These practice sessions, conducted away from enemy fire, allowed pilots to make mistakes and learn from them without the fatal consequences that would result from errors in actual combat. By the time crews flew against real targets, many had conducted dozens of practice runs and achieved genuine mastery of the difficult technique. The Strafer crews developed their own distinctive culture, one that celebrated aggressiveness and innovation. Aircraft were decorated with elaborate nose art, often featuring fierce or menacing images paired with nicknames that reflected the crew's attitudes. Names like Dirty Dora, Hell's Angel, and Pappy's Pram appeared on aircraft noses alongside paintings of devils, angels, cartoon characters, and pin-up girls. The artwork and nicknames served multiple purposes, boosting crew morale, helping ground personnel identify specific aircraft quickly, and contributing to a sense of unit identity and pride. Many pilots, in moments of candor, admitted that the missions felt fundamentally suicidal. Flying at mast height toward a warship that was firing everything it had directly at you certainly qualified as extremely dangerous. The Strafer aircraft lacked armor significant enough to stop the kind of fire they would receive, and there was no safe altitude to fall back to if the attack went wrong. Yet despite understanding the danger, crews continued to volunteer for missions, continued to press home attacks, and continued to achieve results that justified the risks. The courage required to repeatedly fly such missions cannot be overstated. The Japanese military attempted to develop countermeasures and adaptations to the Strafer threat, but none proved particularly effective. More light anti-aircraft guns were bolted onto ship decks, the logic being that if the Strafers were coming in low, then more guns designed for low-altitude engagement might help. The problem was that the sheer volume of fire from a Strafer could silence gun crews in the first seconds of an attack before they could effectively engage. More guns simply meant more crews being killed in those first devastating seconds. Some ship captains attempted radical evasive maneuvers, stopping engines entirely or throwing them into full reverse to change the ship's speed unpredictably, hoping to throw off the bomber's timing for releasing skip bombs. Occasionally these maneuvers might have helped, but more often they simply meant the ship was moving slower when the bombs arrived. A few desperate fighter pilots even attempted ramming attacks against B-25s, recognizing that if they could not shoot down the heavily armed and armored bomber, perhaps they could at least stop it by crashing into it. These suicide tactics occasionally succeeded in destroying a Strafer, but at an unsustainable cost in pilots and aircraft. None of the attempted countermeasures meaningfully reduced the effectiveness of Strafer attacks. The fundamental problem was that the volume of firepower unleashed by a fully armed Strafer could silence defensive positions in just seconds, and the skip bombing technique continued to deliver bombs with high accuracy against evasive targets. Japanese defensive doctrine had been built around assumptions about how aircraft attacks would develop, and those assumptions did not account for the Strafers' unique combination of characteristics. By late 1943, after nearly a year of Strafer operations, the effect on Japanese morale and operations was undeniable. Japanese military reports and personal accounts described the B-25 Strafer as the single most feared weapon system in the Pacific theater. Convoys that might previously have been attempted in daylight were abandoned entirely or postponed until darkness. Ports that had been considered reasonably safe were now avoided after Strafers demonstrated they could strike harbour targets as effectively as ships at sea. Harbours that had once bustled with shipping activity were transformed into graveyards, filled with the wrecks of vessels caught by Strafer attacks. Operations that would have been considered routine just a year earlier had become impossible without accepting unacceptable levels of loss. The strategic balance of power in the Pacific theater had fundamentally shifted. Japan's ability to supply and reinforce forward positions had been crippled. Allied commanders could now plan operations with the confidence that Japanese reinforcements and supplies would likely not arrive in meaningful quantities. The initiative in the theatre had shifted decisively toward the Allies. The legacy of the Strafer aircraft and the tactics developed around it extended far beyond World War II, influencing military aviation doctrine and aircraft design for decades afterward. The fundamental concept of transforming transport or medium bomber aircraft into dedicated gun platforms that could suppress ground or surface targets with overwhelming fire proved its value repeatedly. During the Vietnam War, the United States developed the AC-47 gunship, which mounted multiple machine guns firing from the side of a cargo aircraft. Later variants, like the AC-130, took the concept even further, mounting cannon and precision-guided weapons on airframes originally designed for cargo transport. These aircraft proved devastatingly effective in close air support roles and against ground targets. In modern times, the A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately known as the Warthog, carries forward the concept with its massive 30mm cannon specifically designed for low-level attacks against ground targets. The A-10's entire design philosophy centres around the gun, with the aircraft essentially built around the weapon system. This direct lineage can be traced back to the lessons learned over the Bismarck Sea, where concentrated forward firepower from a relatively slow, heavily armed aircraft proved capable of overwhelming defences and destroying targets that faster, more manoeuvrable aircraft could not effectively engage. For Japan, the psychological damage inflicted by the Strafer campaign proved as severe as the material losses. Survivors of Strafer attacks struggled with trauma for years afterward, haunted by memories of the experience. Many reported nightmares featuring the sight of 8 machine gun muzzles flashing fire, bearing down at sea level with nowhere to run and no way to fight back effectively. Naval commanders who had built their careers on established doctrine were forced to admit that their understanding of naval warfare had been fundamentally incomplete. One officer, writing after the war, reflected that the B-25 Strafers had destroyed not merely ships and men, but the entire conceptual framework through which the Imperial Japanese Navy understood how warfare at sea should be conducted. The confidence that had carried the Japanese Navy through the early war years, built on victories and validated by doctrine, was shattered. In its place came uncertainty and defensive thinking that would characterize Japanese naval operations for the remainder of the war. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea itself was not the largest engagement of the Pacific War, nor did it receive the level of attention and fame accorded to battles like Midway or the Philippine Sea. The number of ships involved was relatively small, and the engagement lasted only minutes. Yet in those brief minutes over the waves on the morning of March 3, 1943, something fundamental had changed. The Japanese Navy had discovered that ingenuity and adaptability, qualities they had prided themselves on in the early war years, could be turned against them. A few modified bombers, armed with nothing more exotic than machine guns taken from existing inventories and bombs that were standard ordnance, flown with exceptional courage by crews who had trained extensively in their new tactics, had effectively dismantled an empire's ability to fight in an entire theatre of operations. The sea that morning became a graveyard, not just for ships and men, but for an entire strategic approach to maritime warfare. The story of the Strafer represents ultimately one of innovation born from necessity and pressure. Mechanics working in makeshift workshops with limited resources, officers willing to challenge conventional thinking and try unorthodox ideas, and aircrews prepared to risk their lives at mast height in attack runs that seemed to violate every principle of safe flying all came together to create something genuinely revolutionary. The 8-gun nose of the B-25 was far more than just a field modification or an interesting technical variation. It became a symbol of adaptation, of the ability to turn perceived weaknesses into devastating strengths, and of how rapidly the balance of military power can shift when creative imagination meets operational necessity. In the face of an enemy that appeared to have superior doctrine and more combat experience, the Allies had improvised a solution that rendered that doctrine obsolete and that experience irrelevant. By the time the war ended in 1945, Strafer aircraft had sunk or damaged hundreds of Japanese vessels, ranging from small coastal freighters to substantial warships. Their missions remained dangerous throughout the war. The losses among Strafer crews were real and significant, but the impact they achieved was undeniable and measurable in both tactical and strategic terms. Veterans who flew these modified B-25s in combat remembered specific details decades later with vivid clarity. They recalled the intense vibration that ran through the entire aircraft when all 8 guns fired simultaneously, the way the frame would shudder and the nose would want to rise from the recoil. They remembered the overwhelming smell of cordite that would fill the cockpit despite ventilation systems, the acrid smoke from fired ammunition mixing with the smell of hydraulic fluid and engine exhaust. They remembered the sight of enemy ships literally breaking apart beneath them as concentrated fire and explosions tore through hull plating and internal structure. These men knew with a certainty that comes from direct experience that they had flown something genuinely unique in aviation history. They had operated an improvised weapon system that had proven decisive in a major theatre of war, and they had done so knowing that each mission might well be their last. On the morning of March 3, 1943, Admiral Kimura had stood on the bridge of his flagship, believing with justified confidence that he was leading a secure convoy through waters that, while not completely safe, were manageable according to established doctrine and experience. By mid-morning of that same day, he was watching his command systematically torn to pieces in a manner that no naval officer anywhere in the world had ever imagined or prepared for. The B-25 Strafer had arrived as an operational weapon system, and with its arrival came the end of Japanese dominance in the Southwest Pacific. The aerial tactics that had seemed so effective before March 3rd were revealed as inadequate. The defensive measures that had protected convoys on previous runs were shown to be insufficient. The doctrine that had been validated by early war successes was proven obsolete by a weapon that should not have existed according to conventional military thinking. In workshops thousands of miles from where the battle took place, mechanics and pilots had created something that changed the course of the war, one machine gun and one skip bomb at a time.